Wesley Monroe yanked open the taxi door, sliding inside without a second glance. JFK Airport, fast, he ordered, checking his watch. The board meeting started in 2 hours and traffic in Manhattan was a nightmare. He barely looked up as he pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails. Yeah, no, a voice said from the driver's seat. This is not a taxi. Wesley's head snapped up. The woman behind the wheel was definitely not a typical cab driver. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a loose ponytail, a few strands framing her face. She had sharp, intelligent eyes and an expression that was somewhere between amused and exasperated. He frowned. Then why are you parked in a taxi zone? She crossed her arms. Because I was waiting for my brother, not a guy in a $3,000 suit who just commandeered my car. Wesley glanced around, realizing the vehicle wasn't even yellow. It was a dark blue sedan, clean but not flashy. He exhaled, running a hand over his face. Great, just great. The woman tilted her head. You seem stressed, bad day. He sighed. If I don't make it to JFK in the next hour, it's about to get worse. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel, considering, then she shrugged. You know what, fine, I've got nothing better to do, I'll take you. His brows lifted. Seriously. She smirked. For $100. He let out a short laugh and pulled out his wallet. $200 if you get me there in 30 minutes. Her grin widened. Buckle up, suit. Wesley had been in his fair share of high-speed luxury cars, but nothing compared to the way this woman weaved through traffic with expert precision. Who are you? He asked, gripping the door handle as she took a sharp turn. Nora Adams, she said, eyes on the road. And you? He hesitated. Wes. He rarely introduced himself as just Wes, but something about her made him want to simplify things. Well, Wes, you're lucky I grew up in the Bronx. I know all the shortcuts. He studied her as she maneuvered through the maze of New York streets. There was something refreshing about her, no pretense, no hesitation. She was just real. So what's in JFK that's worth $200? She asked. An investor meeting, it's important. She glanced at him, and they won't wait for a millionaire. He stiffened. How do you know I'm a millionaire? She chuckled. The suit, the shoes, the way you act like time is money. He shook his head, amused. You're observant. I drive people around for a living. You learn to read them. He frowned. I thought you weren't a taxi driver. She smirked. I drive for a rideshare app when I need extra cash. He glanced around at the clean interior. It smelled faintly of vanilla. You do this full time. She hesitated. Not exactly. I'm saving up for something. He raised a brow. What? She pursed her lips as if debating whether to tell him. A bakery. That caught him off guard. A bakery's. She nodded. I bake, it's my passion. I want my own shop, but New York rents are insane, so here I am, dodging traffic with millionaires in my passenger seat. He found himself smiling. That's unexpected. She side-eyed him. Why? Because I don't look like a baker. No, because you seem like the type who would already have what she wants. Her expression softened, but before she could respond, she pulled up to JFK's terminal. There, 30 minutes, pay up. He pulled out $400 bills and handed them to her. For the best ride of my life. She laughed. You rich guys really do throw money around. He hesitated before stepping out. Can I call you for another ride? She raised a brow. You want a personal driver now? Maybe, he admitted, or maybe I just want an excuse to see you again. She blinked, caught off guard, then she grinned. Tell you what, if you still remember me after your big meeting, find me, I'm always around. He stepped out of the car, watching as she pulled away. Wesley Monroe had never chased after anything in his life, but for some reason, he knew he wasn't letting Nora Adams disappear. Wesley Monroe never forgot people not in his world. He remembered faces, names, and the smallest details about those who mattered. And yet, as he stepped out of his meeting, he realized he had spent the entire time thinking about someone who shouldn't have mattered at all. Nora Adams. She had been a random encounter, a moment of chaos in his otherwise controlled existence. And yet, here he was, scrolling through his phone, trying to figure out how to find her again. His assistant Claire barely glanced up from her tablet as she kept pace beside him. "You look distracted." "I need a ride," he said absently. She frowned. "I can call the car service." "No," he stopped walking, rubbing his jaw. "I need to find someone." Claire finally looked up, adjusting her glasses. "A business contact." "No," he hesitated, then exhaled. "A woman. She drives for a rideshare app." Claire blinked. "You looking for a rideshare driver?" He ignored the judgment in her tone. "Yes." She recovered quickly. "There are ways to track drivers, but it depends on if you booked through an app. Did you?" He shook his head. She sighed. "Then you're asking me to find someone in a city of millions, with no last name and no way to contact her." He glanced at his watch. "You've done harder things." Her lips pressed together, but she didn't argue. "Fine, give me what you know." "She's saving up to open a bakery." Claire arched a brow. "That's what you got." "It's important to her." Claire studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I'll see what I can do." 2 days passed, and Wesley found himself in a part of the city he rarely visited. The bakery Claire had tracked down wasn't Nora's, at least not yet. It was a small shop on a quiet street, the kind of place that exuded warmth. He pushed open the door, and the scent of cinnamon and vanilla wrapped around him. Behind the counter, Nora was rolling dough, her sleeves pushed up, flour dusting her hands. When she looked up and saw him, her brows lifted. Well, the millionaire returns." His lips twitched. "You remember me." She wiped her hands on a towel. Hard to forget a guy who throws $400 at a problem. "I needed a ride." "And now," she crossed her arms, "you need a croissant." He glanced at the display case. "Depends, are they as good as your driving?" She grinned. "Better." He leaned against the counter. "You didn't tell me you already worked at a bakery." She shrugged. "It's not mine, I just help out." "But you want your own." Her expression shifted, something unreadable passing through her eyes. "Yeah, one day." He studied her. "What's stopping you?" She let out a short laugh. "You don't just wake up and buy a bakery, Wes. It takes money, time, and connections." "I have all three." She froze, her smile fading. "What?" He straightened. "I want to invest." She narrowed her eyes. "In what?" "Are you?" She let out a breath, shaking her head. "You don't even know me." "I know enough." She searched his face as if trying to find an angle. "Millionaires don't just throw money at strangers." He met her gaze. "Maybe I'm not like other millionaires." She exhaled, stepping back. "This is crazy." "Is it?" He leaned forward. "You have the talent, you have the passion. What you don't have is someone willing to take a chance on you." She crossed her arms. "And you're that person." "As if you let me be." She studied him, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long silence, she shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "You are either the most generous man I've ever met or the most reckless." He grinned. "Maybe a little of both." She laughed, and for the first time in years, Wesley Monroe felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Nora stared at the man sitting across from her in the tiny bakery's back office, a space barely big enough for the two of them. The scent of warm sugar and cinnamon filled the air, but all she could focus on was Wesley Monroe and the absurd proposition he had just laid out. "You're serious?" she asked, folding her arms. Wesley leaned back in his chair, looking impossibly at ease. "I don't joke about business." She studied him, waiting for the catch. "You want to invest in my dream bakery just like that?" He nodded. "Just like that." A laugh slipped out before she could stop it. "People don't do things like this." He tilted his head. "Maybe not the people you know." She shook her head. "And what do you get out of it?" His gaze held hers, steady and unreadable. "Satisfaction that I helped build something worthwhile." She scoffed, "Oh, come on, you're a millionaire. You don't just throw money at random people for fun." "I've made investments in worse things." She exhaled, running a hand through her hair. "You don't even know if I'm good enough." "I tasted that raspberry tart you gave me earlier," he said. "You're good enough." She hesitated, her pulse quickening. "And you're just offering no strings." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "One string." "Of course, there it was. I knew it," she muttered. "What is it? A stake in the business, naming rights, free pastries for life." His lips curved slightly. "I want to be involved, not in the day-to-day, but I want to see this through. I don't throw money blindly. If I'm doing this, I want to know I backed the right person." She considered him, half expecting him to reveal some ulterior motive, but his expression was calm, patient. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "this is my bakery, my rules." He nodded, agreed. She narrowed her eyes. "You don't get to tell me how to run it." "I wouldn't dream of it." She tapped her fingers against the desk, thinking, this was insane, completely reckless. But the truth was she needed this. She'd been saving every spare dollar for years, and she was still nowhere close. And here was this man, this impossibly wealthy, confident stranger, offering to change everything with a single decision. She took a breath. "All right." His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Satisfaction, maybe. "All right." She shook her head, still unable to believe what she was doing. "If this backfires, I'm blaming you." He stood, buttoning his jacket. "Then I guess I'd better make sure that doesn't happen." As he reached for the door, she called after him, "Wesley." He turned. She hesitated, then rolled her eyes. "Fine, you get free pastries." His grin was quick and unexpected. "I was hoping you'd say that." The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind. True to his word, Wesley didn't interfere with her creative decisions, but he was there. Meetings with realtors, discussions with suppliers, things she had only dreamed about before were suddenly happening. And Wesley Monroe, the man who had stepped into her car by accident, was at the center of it all. One evening, after a long day of scouting locations, they found themselves in a quiet cafe. "You're surprisingly involved for someone who claims they don't want control," she said, stirring her tea. He leaned back in his chair. "I like seeing things take shape." She studied him. "Why do I get the feeling you don't usually do things like this?" He exhaled, looking out the window. "You're right, I don't." "So why me?" His gaze met hers, steady and unreadable. "I don't know." A strange warmth settled in her chest. She wasn't sure what to do with it, so she looked away. "Have you told your family?" he asked. She let out a breath. "My brother knows. He thinks I'm crazy." "And your parents?" She hesitated. "It's just me and my brother." His expression shifted slightly. "I see." She shrugged, forcing a smile. "It is what it is." He didn't press, but his silence was heavy, thoughtful. A few beats passed before she smirked. "What about you? Your billionaire family approve of this little side project?" His lips twitched. "Millionaire." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, excuse me." He chuckled. "They don't know." She raised an eyebrow. "Oh." He exhaled, his fingers tapping against the table. "They wouldn't understand." Nora tilted her head. "Because you don't usually do things like this." He nodded. "Well," she said, leaning back, "guess we're both doing things we don't usually do." He smiled, and something passed between them. Something unspoken, something neither of them was ready to name. For now, that was enough. The bakery smelled like warm vanilla and caramelized sugar, a scent that had slowly become as familiar to Wesley as the leather interior of his luxury cars. He stood near the counter, watching as Nora moved with effortless precision, sliding a tray of fresh pastries onto the cooling rack. Flour dusted her cheek, and there was a streak of chocolate on her wrist, but she had never looked more radiant. "You're staring," she said without looking up. Wesley leaned against the counter. "I'm admiring." She shot him a glance, arching a brow. You sure you're not regretting your investment? He reached for one of the croissants she had set aside, tearing into the flaky layers. If this is the result, I'd invest 100 times over. She shook her head, but there was a spark in her eyes. You've got a dangerous habit of saying things that make me forget you're supposed to be an infuriating businessman. He placed the half-eaten pastry down and stepped closer. And what am I supposed to be instead? Her breath hitched, but she didn't back away. A man who doesn't belong in a place like this. His fingers skimmed over the sleeve of her apron, barely touching. Maybe I'm exactly where I belong. She swallowed, eyes flickering with something unreadable. Then, as if remembering herself, she turned away, wiping her hands on a towel. You have a board meeting in an hour. Shouldn't you be off making millions instead of loitering in my kitchen? I rescheduled. She turned back to him, eyes narrowing. You rescheduled a board meeting for this. For you, he corrected. Her lips parted slightly, but she said nothing. Wesley exhaled, running a hand through his hair. Nora, you have to know by now that this isn't just about a bakery for me. She was quiet for a long moment, fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. I know. His chest tightened, then tell me what's holding you back. She let out a breath, glancing toward the window. I've spent my whole life trying to stand on my own. No handouts, no shortcuts, and then you showed up, throwing open doors I never thought I'd walk through. She looked at him again. It's terrifying. Wesley stepped closer, his voice softer now. You think I don't understand that? She studied him, searching his face. Do you? I've spent years surrounded by people who only want to know me for what can give them, and then I met you. He reached out, brushing a strand of flour-dusted hair from her forehead. You didn't care about my money. You didn't treat me differently when you found out who I was. That's terrifying for me too. Her breath came unsteady now, her fingers gripping the counter. Wesley. Tell me I'm wrong, he murmured. Tell me you don't feel this and I'll walk away. Her lips parted, but no words came. Then, instead of answering, she reached for him, her hands gripping the lapels of his suit as she pulled him down into a kiss. It wasn't tentative or hesitant, it was heat and longing, and all the words they hadn't said. Wesley's arms wrapped around her, pulling her against him like she was the only thing that mattered. When they finally broke apart, her forehead rested against his, breaths mingling. That wasn't fair, she whispered. His lips curved. Neither is pretending we don't want this. She let out a shaky laugh, fingers still tangled in his jacket. So what now? He cupped her jaw, tilting her face up. Now we stop pretending and see where this takes us. Nora inhaled deeply, then nodded. All right. Wesley exhaled, relief flooding through him. All right. And just like that, everything changed. Wesley watched as Nora moved through the newly leased bakery space, her fingers trailing along the empty glass display case. The walls were still bare, the floors scuffed from years of use, but her expression was alight with something he hadn't seen before, pure, unfiltered excitement. She turned to him, her eyes shining. I can't believe this is real. He leaned against the counter, arms crossed. Believe it. She exhaled, shaking her head as if trying to ground herself. Keep expecting someone to wake me up. If they try, I'll personally make sure they regret it, Wesley said, the corner of his mouth lifting slightly. She laughed, tilting her head. You do have a habit of making things happen. He pushed off the counter and stepped closer. That's what I do. I don't wait around. When I see something I want, I go after it. Her breath hitched slightly, but she didn't step back. And what exactly do you want? His gaze didn't waver. You. The word hung between them, heavy and certain. Nora swallowed, her fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. Wesley, this has all been so fast. I know, he interrupted gently, and I know you're scared. She let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. That obvious huh. To me, yes, he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers. But here's the thing, Nora, I don't do things halfway. When I commit to something, I see it through. She looked down at their joined hands, then back up at him. And you're committing to this, to us. His grip tightened slightly. I already have. She exhaled, her lips parting as if she wanted to argue but no words came. Before she could say anything else, the front door swung open and a voice interrupted. "All right, what's this ridiculous thing I keep hearing about?" Nora turned sharply, "Leo." A man stepped inside, his jacket slung over one shoulder, his sharp eyes scanning the space. He had the same strong features as Nora, the same determined set to his jaw. Wesley straightened, immediately recognizing her brother. Leo's gaze flicked between them before landing on Wesley, his expression hardened. "So you're the guy throwing money at my sister." Nora groaned, "Leo, don't start." Wesley stepped forward unfazed. "I prefer to think of it as investing in someone who deserves it." Leo let out a short laugh, clearly unimpressed. "Right, and I'm supposed to believe you're doing this out of the kindness of your millionaire heart." "I don't expect you to believe anything," Wesley said evenly, "but I do expect you to trust that your sister knows what she's doing." Leo's jaw tightened. "She's worked for everything she has, she doesn't need some rich guy sweeping in and—" "I know exactly what I need," Nora cut in, her voice firm. "And right now, I need you to stop acting like I can't make my own choices." Leo hesitated, his gaze softening just slightly as he looked at her. "I'm just looking out for you." "I know," she said gently, "but I wouldn't be doing this if I didn't believe in it." Leo let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right, fine, but if he screws you over, I get to say I told you so." Wesley extended a hand. "Fair enough." Leo eyed him for a moment before shaking it, though his grip was firm, almost testing. Nora rolled her eyes. "Great. Now that we've established who can and can't be trusted, can we talk about something useful, like where I'm getting my first suppliers?" Wesley chuckled. "I've already set up meetings with a few options." Her eyes widened. "You have?" "Of course," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I told you I don't do things halfway." Leo muttered under his breath, "That's what I'm afraid of." Nora shot him a look, but Wesley only smiled. He wasn't worried. Because for the first time in a long time, he knew exactly where he wanted to be. And no overprotective brother, no lingering doubts, nothing was going to change that. The bakery's grand opening was only a week away, and the place was finally coming together. The walls had been painted a warm, inviting shade of cream, new display cases gleamed under soft lighting, and the scent of fresh bread and pastries already filled the air from Nora's test batches. The sign above the shop read Nora's Bakehouse, a simple but perfect name. Wesley stood near the entrance, watching Nora as she adjusted a row of carefully arranged pastries in the display case. She was in her element here, completely focused, her hands moving with practiced precision as she arranged everything just so. He had seen her determined before, but this was different. This was her dream finally becoming reality. "You're hovering," she said without looking up. He leaned against the counter. "I call it observing." She glanced at him, eyes narrowing slightly. "You call it interfering." He raised his hands in surrender. "I haven't touched a thing." "Yet," she muttered, shaking her head. "I know you, Wesley. You can't help but take charge of everything." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Accept this. This is all you, Nora." Her hands stilled for a moment before she straightened, brushing flour off her apron. "You really don't regret this?" His gaze held hers, not for a second. She exhaled, something unreadable flickering in her expression. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't have to." Her lips parted as if she wanted to argue, but before she could, the front door swung open and Leo walked in, carrying a box. "If I have to haul one more thing for this bakery, I'm charging you an hourly rate," he grumbled. Nora rolled her eyes. "You're getting free pastries for life, that's your payment." Leo set the box down on the counter. "I feel like I should have negotiated better." Wesley chuckled. "You're not the first to say that." Leo shot him a look, but there was no real bite to it. Over the past few weeks, the tension between them had eased, and while Leo still had his protective streak, he had stopped treating Wesley like a walking red flag. Nora pulled open the box, revealing stacks of custom packaging with the bakery's logo. She ran her fingers over the smooth surface, her expression softening. It's really happening, isn't it? Leo nudged her shoulder. You're about to own the best bakery in the city, of course it's happening. Wesley's voice was quieter, you made it happen. She swallowed, looking from Leo to Wesley. I wouldn't have gotten here alone. Leo shrugged, yes, yeah, just don't get all emotional on me. Nora laughed, shaking her head, you're impossible. And you're the one who's been bossing me around for weeks. Before Nora could retort, Wesley cleared his throat. Actually, Leo, can I borrow you for a moment? Leo raised an eyebrow, should I be worried? Not unless you plan on objecting to what I'm about to do. Leo glanced at Nora, then back at Wesley. All right, let's talk. Nora frowned, what are you two plotting? Wesley smiled, you'll see soon enough. Later that evening, after the bakery had been locked up for the night, Wesley took Nora to the rooftop of the building. A small table was set up, lit by soft, flickering candlelight. A bottle of wine rested in a silver bucket, and the city skyline stretched out behind them, glittering against the night sky. Nora's eyes widened. Wesley, what is this? He pulled out a chair for her. Dinner, a celebration. She hesitated but sat down, watching him carefully as he poured them each a glass of wine. You didn't have to do all this. I wanted to. She shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. You're impossible, you know that. He reached across the table, taking her hand. I prefer relentless. She exhaled, her fingers tightening around his. I'm guessing this isn't just about the bakery opening. No, he admitted, it's about something more. Her heartbeat quickened. Wesley. He stood, pulling a small box from his pocket. Then, right there, with the city lights shining behind him, he lowered himself onto one knee. Nora gasped, her free hand flying to her mouth. Wesley's voice was steady, but there was something raw in his eyes. From the moment I met you, you challenged everything I thought I knew about my life. You're passionate, stubborn, incredible, and I don't want to spend another day without knowing you're mine. He opened the box, revealing a stunning diamond ring. Nora Adams, will you marry me? Her eyes shimmered, her breath uneven. Are you serious? He smiled. Have I ever not been? A tear slipped down her cheek, but she was already nodding. Yes, Wesley, yes. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms, kissing her deeply. When they finally broke apart, she rested her forehead against his. You really don't do things halfway, do you? Not when it comes to you. The wedding was an intimate but stunning affair, held in a garden surrounded by twinkling lights. Nora wore a dress that made Wesley forget how to breathe, and when she walked down the aisle, he knew with absolute certainty that this was the best decision he had ever made. Leo gave a speech that was half heartfelt, half lightly threatening, but mostly it was a celebration of the woman they all adored. As Wesley pulled Nora onto the dance floor that night, he held her close, his hands resting on the small of her back. So, Mrs. Monroe, how does it feel? She laughed, her fingers threading through his hair. Unbelievable. He pressed a kiss to her temple. Get used to it. She smiled up at him, her eyes full of love. I think it could. And as they danced beneath the stars, surrounded by the people who mattered most, Wesley knew what happiness truly felt like. He had fought for empires, built fortunes, and conquered boardrooms. But none of it had ever compared to this. To her. To forever.